In my last video on morality in games, I pointed out that moral systems were designed to incorporate morality into games in a direct and tangible manner. But the limitations on these systems caused them to be ultimately self-defeating. In this video and others, we'll look at problems they were trying to solve, and the complexity of incorporating morality into games in general. Most games, if they bother, throw you into a world with an objective and at best, vaguely defined justification for that objective. The original Legend of Zelda, for example, arguably the game that defined the adventure genre for a lot of gamers, provided no in-game context and simply a story in the instruction manual. And yet this alone was enough to send imaginations soaring about adventuring in games. Flash forward to today, where there are a myriad of options for game developers. Voiced conversations, cinematics, and in-game lore have the capability to convey moral decisions and character development unthinkable back in the early years of gaming. The tools are seemingly endless. And yet gamers in general, I would argue, seem to be unsatisfied a lot of the time with how morality and moral expressions occur in gaming. Complaints about good choices feeling less than fulfilling, lack of nuance, and lackluster character development are pretty common. And with identity politics causing havoc in the gaming scene as well as persistent negative attitudes toward religion, this problem will continue and probably get worse before it gets better. So why is it that moral texture in gaming seems to fall flat compared to, say, movies or books? What is it about games that cause moral decisions and character development to come up short? And more importantly, how is it that this is even a problem given all the tools available? These questions aren't easy to answer and require us to dive into a lot of topics ranging from game design to moral philosophy. As a result, we will most likely return to these subjects multiple times from different angles. That also means I have plenty of subjects for videos. Yay! So let's kick this series off by doing what we normally shouldn't do, apples to oranges comparisons. But in contrasting, that's the word I'm looking for, video games with books and movies, I think we can start to see some of the complexities that game designers face. Control issues! One challenge that video game developers contend with that most media does not is that games are an interactive media. That is, the game designer must respond to actions that the gamer takes, and depending on the level of complexity of interaction, trying to keep a consistent moral theme can be difficult if not impossible. To see what I'm getting at, compare games with movies or books in this respect. Movies or books do not have any consumer interaction. The watcher/reader is a passive consumer of these kinds of media. Thus the creator has direct control over all content, context, and actions that take place in the work itself. This means that creating a world that is internally consistent is easier, though by no means a guarantee. Video games, on the other hand, have the added complexity of human interaction to plan for when creating a world's moral framework. What a player can do in the context of the game can make or break consistency in a game's world design. Too much flexibility runs the risk of chaos, while too little flexibility increases the chances of disengagement of the player, unless you are Grand Theft Auto in the former case and Metal Gear Solid in the latter case. Because of this, one of the biggest issues with designing games that are heavily story-driven is finding the balance between narrative and player interaction. Crafting both sides of this dynamic while keeping both consistent with each other has proven to be quite challenging to game designers. The bigger the scope of the game, the bigger the problem. I'll use a fairly famous example from the Tomb Raider reboot. In one of the opening sequences, Lara, our heroine, obtains and fires a gun for the first time in self-defense. In the story cinematic, she reacts quite badly to taking a life for the first time. But then when the player takes over, she now has the ability to gun down enemies with abandon immediately and doesn't seem to bat an eye about all the bloodletting. This disjointed application of player ability contrasts with the story we just witnessed, causing a disconnect between narrative and gameplay. Yet really, the designers of the game were following good game design practices. Conventional gaming wisdom holds that when the player gets an item, he can expect to use that item at the time. And making such a big deal out of getting the gun in narrative would only reinforce the idea that we now get to use the gun without restriction. Having said that, notice the back and forth. I feel like more could have been done here. Maybe aiming down the sights of the gun jiggered around to reflect Lara's emotional state, requiring a button to press to gather herself before she could aim straight. And then later on, you could upgrade Lara's abilities to make that automatic. This is just one way of designing a game in a way that merges design and narrative. So what does all this have to do with morality in games? Well, consider the same issue from a moral choice perspective. Suppose, for example, in a story the player's character is given the choice to kill a criminal who has wronged him. And as a game designer, you need to figure out what, if any, options you will give the player in this situation. So at first glance, this looks fairly straightforward. Give the player the option to kill the guy or let him live, right? Well, not so fast. What if this is a pivotal moment in the character development that requires the player character to kill the villain for the narrative? Do you just extend the cutscene, or do you give the player control just to press a button? Now let's back it up a bit. Maybe you do want to give the player an actual choice. Is it enough to just give them the choice to kill or let them live? Maybe having the ability to imprison them is another good one, but that requires even more narrative setup and could alter the character altogether. And here's a real head spinner. What if the theme of your narrative up until this point is freedom? What does your game say if the story is all about freedom to fight against destiny only to be reduced to a binary choice of kill the villain or spare him? Some may balk at this type of inconsistency, but this type of problem actually occurred. And these questions are simply from the perspective of keeping a story consistent in its theming. We haven't even gotten to how particular choices, and even how one makes a choice, can have an effect on consistency within a narrative-driven game. But even in these few examples, we can see great care needs to be applied when trying to balance game design with narrative themes, especially during pivotal moments in the narrative. And given how game design and plot can change over the course of development, keeping all this cohesive is a real challenge. So as you can see, crafting the design of the game and the narratives to make a cohesive whole can be really tricky. It's hard enough in movies and books where one has complete control over the content, but factoring in the need for player interaction can take a complicated problem and make it mind-melting. And that's enough for today. We will dig deeper into this in the future. But for right now, thanks for joining me for this discussion, and we will see you next time. Hey everyone, thanks for watching my video to the end. If you like more of this, you can click on the subscribe link at the bottom, and as you can see, there are a couple of other videos that you can click on as well. One of them is one of my prior reviews or another content video, and the other one is going to be a playthrough that I'm doing. So feel free to click on either one. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks very much.